Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're switching it up a little bit today. We're doing a three-person show today. I've got two great columnists from our Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Jason Mackey, Paul Zeise, and we're going to have a little bit of a friendly debate here about something that happened in baseball that's been very widely talked about, and just kind of get different perspectives on the impact that it has on the history of the game when it comes to Negro Leagues. Now, of course, the Negro League stats are now officially included with Major League Baseball, making this really relevant for Pittsburgh because Josh Gibson is now the leading batter in average on base percentage, slugging percentage, on base plus slugging percentage, and that sparked up a lot of different topics around the country, not just around Pittsburgh, but especially kind of putting Pittsburgh in the center of things. So Jason and Paul have kind of expressed different sides of opinions here, and I thought it'd be a really fun discussion to have with them. Welcome to the show here. That's also brought to you by Mike's Beer Bar. I want to lead off with Paul here because Paul, you came out with a column talking about this, and I wanted to, and you were kind of saying, hey, this whole changing history thing, you called it silly and misguided. Can you just run through the base of your points here? Because I thought you made some really good points in your article.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things about history is you can't change it. No matter how many different ways you want to try and change it, you can't. What happened, happened. And I think we are in this country so afraid of understanding history, embracing what happened, and basically just saying this actually happened. And so that's the first part about it. The second part about it is the whole point of this and the whole reason for this is from this misguided notion that somehow we can whitewash what actually happened. And to me, you can't. Baseball was segregated. Baseball's past was very ugly. And guess what? Major League Baseball should have to wear that past. And they shouldn't be able to say, oh, well, you know what? After the fact here now, guess what? Okay. I mean, are they going to pay reparations to all the black players that they locked out of their league? Probably not. I'm going to go out on a limb and say they're not going to do that. You know what I mean? So to me, it's understandable why people think it's, oh, well, it was something that was ugly in our history and we have to right the wrong. You can't. It happened. And quite frankly, I think what bothers me the most is the Negro Leagues stand on their own. Mm-hmm. This is not, and people, I've had people yell, sending me these emails saying, oh, you just don't want black players to be recognized. Who said that? I didn't say that at all. In fact, it's the opposite. Right. I said the Negro Leagues as a whole should be celebrated as Negro Leagues because of why they happened. And guess what? There's a lot of, and Chris, I mean, I'm assuming you've probably had, your grandfather or your uncle or somebody who probably can share, stories with you about
they did.
And the thing about it is there's a lot of charm. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of things that made the Negro League special. So to me, this is just, basically Rob Manfred, jumping. I couldn't have said it any better than Howard Bryant. This was Rob Manfred jumping on the wave in the the Black Lives Matter summer, jumping on the wave of, let's see, how can we as an institution show that we really care? Well, you know what you did, and then forget about all that. And I'll just this will be the last point I make, and then I'll let you take it. One of the things in sports, like I do sports talk radio. We all work in sports. You do podcasts, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We have, sometimes you go to a bar, you argue with people about things, right? And that's part of the charm of sports because a lot of what we do is subjective. Do you know the one thing that's not subjective? Stats, records, and things like record books. That's not subjective. That's objective. And when I see things like, well, Josh Gibson is now the leader in batting average for a single season. We can't tell you how many times he actually struck out because there's no records of it, but we know that he hit this. When I see, well, Josh Gibson is the leader in slugging percentage, for instance, right? And, depending on who you talk to and which historian you believe and who you read, the Hall of Fame, right? He hit somewhere between 166, which is actually the official number in the record book.
Of home runs, yeah.
Or 1,200 home runs. Okay? So how are we doing this especially when, and the larger point is, Josh Gibson didn't play in the major leagues. Whatever you want to say about the record book, it's all those white stars of the past. Yeah, you're right, but they actually played in the major league. So, Major League Baseball has to wear that, but forget about that. Even if you want to make the argument that, well, the Negro League players, they should be recognized this way, you're almost guessing at all of their stats. And this is not a point that white people have made. This is a point that if you talk to a lot of the players, they made it back in the day. Anyway, go ahead.
Jason, I wanted to give you your chance because you kind of sat on the opposite side where you hear Paul's points, but at the same time, like you're more on the side of this does make sense to include that. Can you go through kind of what you've talked about both on your shows here on the Post-Gazette and in your columns?
One of the things that I think is important, and I don't disagree with a lot of what Paul is saying. Like, I think Major League Baseball should wear it. I think the the Negro Leagues hold a cool distinction. Not a cool. I mean, it's a tough word, but like, it's a special thing. It's a prideful thing, right? Like, nobody's trying to take that away. Nobody's trying to diminish what the Negro Leagues, what you're trying to do theoretically is accentuate what should have been possible, what was not possible. No, I don't agree with the Rob Manfred MLB hype machine trying to make this kind of a PR spin, which is what I think it comes off as. What you're trying to do is recognize these players and give them recognition that was not possible at the time. I don't think anybody can look at Josh Gibson, Cool Papa Bell, Satchel Paige, or whatever, and say that these guys didn't deserve to be recognized with some of their peers at the time. And I think that's what you're trying to do. Now, I think it comes off a certain way. Like it does look a little bit tacky. Major League Baseball is trying to promote this, and like, you can't change the past. It still happened, and in ways, it celebrate the living hell out of the Negro Leagues, and that's great. In other ways, yes, there's a lot of stuff that people who came before us did wrong and should be learned from. And that, like, far be it from me to tell people how to handle something like that, but it still existed. So anyway, the last point I wanted to make off of what Paul said was a little bit of subjectivity. And I understand that stats are black and white. You can't change them, whatever. But I do think with everything in the Major League Baseball record books, it requires context. It is subjective to some degree. I can't look at what Shohei Ohtani does right now and compare it to, Wilbur, whatever his name is, in 1897, right? Like, if Ohtani was hitting off of those dudes, he would absolutely crush them. I'm of the belief that if you give Ty Cobb at bats today, he's probably not touching the ball. That's just my own personal opinion. I think you're looking at eras and contextualizing them. And so that's all we're doing here. And so what's the difference between looking at what Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige, and Judy Johnson and other people did in the Negro Leagues when they were denied an opportunity to play in Major League Baseball versus the context required to look at what happened in 1901 and saying those guys were really good players?
Paul, I think that's where, like, I kind of see both sides of this, right? Is that it should be acknowledged that Major League Baseball was plagued with the thing the entire country had to deal with: segregation, racism, the reason why black players and players of colors were excluded from this league. But I also hear it's like, hey, you know what? These players, they were great players in their own rights, and Josh Gibson, being one of the greatest players of all time. I think people all acknowledge that across the board, with the Negro Leagues. I just think it's that interesting middle ground right now where it's like, hey, how do you acknowledge these guys and say this, and try to include these guys with the major league heroes of the past without, and at the same time, you'll find that line of where it is. Paul, do you feel like there is a solution for, like, kind of acknowledging how great these players are without including them in the stats? Like you said, like, how that's not a good idea.
Well, I mean, I think we've already done that. I mean, how many of them are in the Hall of Fame?
Yeah,
they're in the Hall of Fame. And I don't think there's been listen, in my lifetime, I don't think there's ever been a shortage of people who have acknowledged how great the Negro League players are. The reason we know about Cool Papa Bell, the reason we know about Satchel Paige, the reason we know about Josh Gibson, the reason we know about all these guys, even guys like Buck Leonard and, guys like that, is because there have been plenty of opportunities to recognize them for their greatness and who they are. And in fact, the Pirates have done it with Josh Gibson. A lot of these teams, these major league teams have done it where they've recognized these guys. If you're in the Hall of Fame, it means you're in the discussion as the greatest players, one of the greatest players of all time. If you're in the Hall of Fame,
Paul, let me ask you something, because this is where I struggle with, and I want to jump in here. How do you reconcile those players' families wanting those stats to be included? Like Paige's family, Gibson's family, Buck Leonard's family, like they all want this. And I feel like an idiot as the 40-year-old white male saying that shouldn't happen. Like Gibson, Pat, they should get what they want. They deserve that.
My response is, I want to date Holly Berry, but she doesn't want to date me. That's my response.
How do you know if you have?
So at the end of the day, I mean, I'm glad the families, they should want it, but the bottom line is, there are millions of ways to celebrate these guys, and I think they've been celebrated. And there's other ways you can do it, even if you don't feel like it, they've been celebrated enough. There's a lot of ways that we recognize people and celebrate them with their accomplishments. That's completely a different discussion in my mind, which is why I find it comical. Like, there are some people saying, "Oh, well, you just don't want Josh Gibson and these guys to get recognized." No, that's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying the opposite of that. What I'm saying is, record books are objective facts, statistics, whatever. That's what they are. And so, you can't change that. No matter how many different ways you want to change that, you can't. And the biggest problem, there would be a stronger argument if we weren't guessing at these stats. Mm-hmm. It'd be a stronger argument with me.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is, there's a lot of guesswork. Like I said, I think the greatest example is that the year that right now in Major League Baseball record book, the year that the guy had the highest batting average of all time, nobody can tell you how many times he struck out because there's no records of it. I mean, and the other part of it is, and this is where I think it probably bothers me the most. Why isn't Josh Gibson the home run leader?
Because they don't have, yeah.
Well, they don't have numbers. Number one, they don't have the numbers. Right. But again, they're guessing at everything else. On his Hall of Fame plaque, it says he hit between 800 and 1,000 home runs. I'll tell you why, and this is why I say it's misguided, and the subjective nature with which they're doing this. Unless I'm mistaken, all of the people that were taken out of the record book or taken, they were the all-time leader and now they're second or third or whatever. Every one of them played pre-1947. Mm. I mean, it's so transparent what they're doing here. Yeah. The home run record's a modern record, right? It's a modern record, so we'll leave that one intact. But all of these ones that were the Honus Wagners and the Ty Cobbs and all of these other guys, it's amazing. Like, to me, that it's so transparent why the selective nature, the subjective, but more importantly, the transparency of what they were trying to do here. Again, I always go back to what happened in history happened in history. So,
sorry, go ahead.
So, and no matter how many different ways we want to erase certain parts of our history, I always say we should want to learn from our history, and it is ugly. All the ugly parts, we should keep that alive so people understand what the struggles that everyone went through to get to where we're at, and we don't ever want to go back there. And so, it's a different thing altogether, but it's why I have always said we should leave statues of Confederate people in the South. We should leave them up so that we can, so someone like me can tell my kids when we're walking by, look at this. This is the Civil War. This is what happened. This is how much they hated us in this country, right? It should be a reminder of where we were at, what actually happened, and where we don't ever want to go again. That's just my opinion. I mean, that's just me.
I got you, Jason. I wanted to get your point on the stats one because Paul's right. As a kid growing up, like, you know, my dad loved sports and he always told me about the Negro Leagues and Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige, like all these great players. And I was like, Josh Gibson did what? And I would like go on my AOL dial-up internet and be like, okay, how many home runs did Josh Gibson hit? And I would see 1,000, 2,000. Like there were so many numbers that no one said 2,000, but there were these numbers. There were these stories about how he hit a baseball so high in Pittsburgh, no one found it, and then they played a game in Cincinnati the next day, and a ball just fell into a guy's mitt, and they were like, "He's out from yesterday." Like
that was just a home run that I had given up, and it wasn't that. No.
but that's the thing is that it's like that. Those are the kind of things there that as growing up, I didn't know and I saw people saying he didn't hit this many home runs. That's not what this historian said. How do you reconcile that part of the argument when it's like, hey, yeah, that there is a bit of wonkiness as far as the stats keeping, but it being part of the day?
Yes, and there is some wonkiness, and I don't think it's because of lack of effort. I think it's because of lack of available resources in some cases. I think we're logically in a weird place here because, I mean, a big part of why this happened, guys, Elias Sports Bureau, Seam Heads, Retro Sheet, these are services that are otherwise recognized as official stat keeping people in Major League Baseball. So if we're going to say that these stats are somehow invalid or incomplete, we're saying that Elias Sports Bureau is not doing a complete job. Like they're putting their stamp on something that theoretically should be commensurate with every other record that we cite. And I understand that stuff is limited, and I understand the idea of saying like this isn't enough to incorporate it into Major League Baseball records. But I can't say that they're BS, is the best way I can put it. Like I'm not going to take issue with Elias.
Well, I am, because they're doing it retroactively, and they're doing it in large part, in some ways, because of very spotty records. In some ways, they're doing it anecdotally. I mean, listen, I'm sure they did the best job they can possibly have done. But at the end of the day, I think it's very clear to me that many of the stats are just not necessarily accurate. And so, I mean, listen, I'm not saying Josh Gibson didn't hit what's his record now, 462 or something in 1943 or whatever year. I'm not saying he did or he didn't, but I sure would like to know how many times he struck out.
Yeah,
I sure would like to know how many of those games were actual games and how many of those games were exhibitions, because there's a lot, these Negro League teams, they needed, they would make extra money by playing exhibitions.
Well, you know what? Major League Baseball,
things like that.
Major League Baseball screwed itself here, by the way. I mean, they raised its hand. They raised their hand in the middle of the George Floyd stuff and then created this. And then you can't just take it back.
No, you can't. Unfortunately,
they have to go through with this. And it had been a long time. And I mean, again, I'm of the position I don't have any issue with these people being like with them doing what they're doing and recognizing who we're recognizing. I don't have an issue. But again, you can't not do it. After you said you were going to do it, in the middle of that, you can't not come through, because then you look even worse.
Right. But now what happens 15 years from now, 20 years from now, when Chris Carter has a grandson? And his why
are you putting that on me, Paul? I don't even have my life yet. I'm not that old.
And the records no longer suggest that there was a Negro League, because that's sort of where we're whitewashing it, and that's sort of where we're pushing it to. And that to me, it's a problem.
Would it do that though? Because like I thought one of the things I found your article fascinating, Paul, and then I was reading the comments under it, and someone made the comparison like, yeah, they don't count the AFL stats anymore when they merged the NFL, and then someone pointed out, no, they do count the AFL.
Right,
stats.
Those two, but those two leagues merged. They actually merged and became one league.
I agree with that. My whole thing was I think you can whereas I hear your whole argument about like we should not whitewash history. We should not try to just say, oh, segregation, that didn't happen. Don't mind these stats. They're included now. But I do think there's a way to say like, hey, these guys did exist, and these Negro Leagues did exist, and here's the numbers from the Negro Leagues, and we're including them in our stats. I think there's merit to that part of it. But I do agree with both of you. I think Major League Baseball botched this whole process how they could include it.
How about putting them in as in the Major League Baseball record book as Negro League stats, so they're being recognized for what they are. I
Paul,
mean,
you solved the 3.5-year problem.
I'm just saying, to me, there's so many ways, like there's so many ways, and I feel like to me, there's so many ways we could still completely, with respect to the Negro Leagues, recognize the best players, and not just the best of the best players, but there were a lot of good players that played pre-1947 that wouldn't have been superstars in the Major League Baseball, but they would have been good role players. And, and those are the kind of guys, to me, I would rather see them get recognition because, quite frankly, everybody knows Josh Gibson.
Right.
He's gotten as much recognition and credit
the flowers
as he's deserved. So to me, at the end of the day, I look at that and I say, what we haven't done with the Major Leagues and what this won't do, or with the Negro Leagues, and what this won't do is recognize all those guys that we haven't talked about or barely have heard about, who were, really good players, that weren't necessarily superstars. I mean, it's easy to say, oh yeah, well, 11 of the next 14 National League MVPs were black. Okay, it was Frank Robinson, Jackie Robinson, I think Hank Aaron was one of them. I mean, we're talking about the best of the best of the best. Those guys have all gotten far more recognition than the guys who maybe came into the league and quite frankly in 1947 probably to about 1960, if you weren't a superstar black player, you weren't going to get an opportunity to play, because the bottom line that all these teams were basically like, well, yeah, we'll take the best of the best, but I can't sell tickets if I've got too many of them on my team. So if you weren't a superstar, you were probably still stuck playing in some barnstorming league. But those are the guys that we should be really looking hard to recognize. Yes. That's my point.
Well, and Major League Baseball should use this as a jumping off point to something larger. If you want to do something more than get the PR flowers or just make this sound good, actually dig deep into what you're doing to recognize the Negro Leagues and players that Paul's talking about. And that would also be listening to these families. Like Sean Gibson is a very important voice for a lot of these families. He's very much in the camp of seeing stats recognized. Okay, another thing that Sean wants to do is May 2nd, I wrote this in my story, make this a Negro Leagues Day, just like Jackie Robinson Day, just like Roberto Clemente Day. I can't think of a reason why you wouldn't do that and educate every city and talk about every player, not just the marquee guys, but use this as an opportunity to say, okay, we're incorporating these stats, but we also think that the Negro Leagues history and what it means across the country is important. We're going to take at least one day, hopefully more, to celebrate that. But I can't say I would expect Major League Baseball to do it. I just think it would be a good idea.
And to both of y'all's points on this, guys, like that's part of the cool thing about growing up here in Pittsburgh. And like I grew up in the 90s, and like that was like right around the time a lot of the guys who played in the Negro Leagues, they were really they were getting to the back of the age. A lot of them had passed on at that point, but there were still guys who were around. And like there were guys who like I grew up in Point Breeze, Homewood, East Liberty, the Hill District, and like people would say, "Hey, that guy played in the Negro Leagues." I'm like, "What?" And they weren't Josh Gibson, they weren't superstars, but they were like you said, Paul, and you said, Jason, these were role players. These were guys that, hey, you know what? They were able to battle and do. They were the guys that would play in Major League Baseball nowadays for 5 or 6 years and go up and down between the minors and the majors. And I think that's part of the recognition that a lot of these families want is like, hey, my great grandpap was a bad second baseman. He could steal bases. He was fast and he was a bad man, but he never got the recognition because he played in the Negro Leagues and he wasn't one of those big names. And I think that is a very interesting point of this conversation.
It certainly is. I have to run.
Absolutely. I was going to say, guys, thank you so much for joining us here in the North Shore Drive podcast. Find all your podcasts here from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette on YouTube and on your favorite podcasting app. We'll see you again Monday here on the North Shore Drive podcast. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.